The room didn't go silent when Donald Trump started talking about trade. It didn't go silent when he discussed deficits. And it didn't go silent when he criticized Canada's negotiating position. The room went silent when he called Mark Carney a liar. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. And within minutes, what had started as a routine economic briefing was becoming one of the most talked about political confrontations in North America. Because this wasn't a disagreement over policy, it wasn't a debate over strategy, and it wasn't a normal diplomatic exchange between two allied nations. The accusation was personal, direct, and unusually blunt, especially considering it involved the leader of one of America's closest partners. Inside the briefing room, reporters immediately sensed something had changed. The atmosphere shifted, conversation stopped. People looked up from laptops and notes. Veteran political correspondents who had witnessed years of tense exchanges suddenly found themselves paying closer attention. Because everyone understood the same thing. Once a political disagreement becomes personal, the story changes completely. No longer is the debate about numbers, or trade, or economics. Now it's about credibility, trust, and reputation. And those battles tend to become far more explosive. The accusations centered around trade figures and economic data that had become increasingly important in ongoing discussions between Washington and Ottawa. According to the president's remarks, Carney had allegedly misrepresented key information about the economic relationship between the two countries. It was a serious charge, the kind of charge that demands a response. And that's exactly what everyone expected next, a response. Within minutes, television networks were replaying the exchange. Political commentators were debating its significance. Social media platforms were filling with reactions. And across North America, people were asking the same question. How would Ottawa answer? Because in modern politics, public accusations almost always trigger public counterattacks. Long statements, press conferences, competing narratives, political escalation. That's the pattern people have become accustomed to. But what nobody knew at that moment was that the response being prepared in Ottawa would take a very different path. A path that would ultimately become the bigger story. Because while attention focused on the accusation, another question was quietly beginning to emerge. What if the numbers being disputed weren't actually Canadian numbers at all? That possibility would soon transform the entire controversy, and it would force journalists, analysts, and political observers to start looking at the evidence itself. Not the accusation, the evidence. But before we get there, you have to understand why tensions between Washington and Ottawa were already rising long before this confrontation ever happened. Because the accusation didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the latest chapter in a much larger story. A story involving trade, political pressure, economic negotiations, and two leaders increasingly finding themselves on opposite sides of the same argument. The cameras captured the explosion, but they didn't capture the pressure that had been building underneath it. And once that pressure finally surfaced, everything changed. Because what began as a single accusation was about to become a battle over credibility itself. And in politics, those battles are often the hardest to win. To understand why this confrontation exploded so quickly, you have to understand what the argument was actually about. Because despite all the headlines, despite all the outrage, and despite all the attention surrounding the accusation, the dispute wasn't originally about personalities. It was about numbers, trade numbers, economic data, and competing claims about the relationship between Canada and the United States. For months, economic tensions had been growing beneath the surface. Disagreements over trade balances, questions about manufacturing, concerns about supply chains, political arguments about who was benefiting more from the economic relationship. Both governments were under pressure, and both leaders were speaking to audiences that wanted results. That's important to understand, because when political leaders discuss trade, they're rarely speaking only to each other. They're speaking to workers, businesses, investors, voters, entire industries. Every number suddenly carries political weight, and every statistic becomes part of a larger narrative. That's exactly what made the accusation so significant. Because according to the claims made during the confrontation, the disputed figures had supposedly created a false picture of the economic relationship between the two countries. If true, it would have been a major problem, not just politically, but diplomatically. A leader misrepresenting official data is a serious accusation, and that's why the story immediately gained traction. At first, many observers assumed the disagreement would become a technical battle. Economists versus economists, charts versus charts, reports versus reports, the kind of dispute that usually stays confined to policy circles. But then, something unexpected happened. Journalists began tracing the source of the numbers, and what they discovered changed the conversation. The figures at the center of the dispute were reportedly not produced by Canadian agencies. They weren't generated by outside consultants, and they weren't pulled from some obscure international database. According to the reports being discussed, the data came from official American government sources. That detail changed everything, because suddenly the debate wasn't simply, are the numbers correct? The debate became, where did the numbers come from? And once that question entered the conversation, the spotlight shifted. Fast. Political analysts immediately recognized the danger. If the data was genuinely sourced from American institutions, then the argument could no longer be framed as Canada versus the United States. Instead, it risked becoming an argument about the credibility of the information itself, and that's a much more complicated fight. Because governments rely on their own agencies to provide trusted economic data. Businesses rely on it. Markets rely on it. Policymakers rely on it. Undermining confidence in those institutions carries consequences that extend far beyond a single political disagreement. That's why attention increasingly moved away from the accusation and toward the evidence. Reporters wanted clarification, commentators wanted explanations, and audiences wanted answers, because everyone could sense the story evolving in real time. What began as a political attack was becoming a credibility battle. And credibility battles are dangerous, not because they're loud, but because they're difficult to control. Once people start examining evidence for themselves, the narrative can move in unexpected directions, and that's exactly what was about to happen. Back in Ottawa, advisors were reportedly preparing responses. Long responses, detailed responses, the kind of responses political teams usually build during moments like these. Documents, talking points, data, explanations, everything. But then a different decision was made. A decision that would ultimately turn this controversy into a viral political moment. Because while Washington was defending an accusation, Ottawa was preparing a response that would take less than a minute to deliver. That response would end up dominating the entire story. By the time Ottawa began preparing its response, most people thought they knew exactly what was coming. A lengthy press conference, pages of economic data, charts, experts, government officials, the usual political playbook. After all, when a leader is publicly accused of being a liar, the normal instinct is to fight back with overwhelming force. More facts, more arguments, more explanations, more words. And according to reports surrounding the controversy, that option was available. Advisors had reportedly prepared extensive material, supporting evidence, talking points, detailed explanations, everything needed to launch a full-scale rebuttal. But then something unusual happened. Instead of expanding the response, it was reduced. Instead of adding more words, the message became shorter, much shorter. And that decision may have changed the entire trajectory of the story. Because while political teams often assume that more information creates more persuasion, modern audiences don't always work that way. People are overwhelmed with information. They scroll faster, watch shorter clips, consume headlines in seconds. And in that environment, simplicity can become a weapon. That's exactly the strategy Ottawa appeared to embrace. When Mark Carney finally stepped in front of the cameras, the scene surprised many observers. There were no giant graphics, no complicated presentations, no dramatic display of experts standing behind him. Just a podium, a single sheet of paper, and a room full of journalists waiting to see how he would respond. The statement began calmly. No visible anger, no emotional outbursts, no attempt to match accusation with accusation. Instead, Carney reportedly walked viewers through the source of the disputed figures, point by point, agency by agency, identifying where the numbers had come from and why they had been cited in the first place. Then came the moment that changed everything. The moment that transformed a political disagreement into a viral media event. Because after laying out the basic facts, Carney presented what communication experts later described as a difficult choice for the audience. Either the data had not been reviewed properly before the accusation was made, or the data had been reviewed and the accusation was made anyway. Suddenly, the discussion wasn't focused on trade anymore. It wasn't focused on tariffs. It wasn't focused on economics. The focus shifted to credibility. And once credibility becomes the center of a story, every word matters. Then came the line everyone would remember. 5 words, 1 image, 1 idea. A response so short that many viewers initially thought there had to be more coming afterward. There wasn't. The word he is looking for is mirror. That was it. No insults, no dramatic escalation, just one carefully chosen word that instantly reframed the entire argument. And within minutes, the clip was spreading across social media. Television producers were replaying it. Political commentators were dissecting it. And audiences across multiple countries were debating what they had just watched. The reason it worked wasn't necessarily because everyone agreed with it. The reason it worked was because everyone understood it, immediately. A mirror reflects. A mirror sends something back. A mirror turns attention around. Whether people supported Carney or not, the symbolism was impossible to miss. Communication analysts would later point to another factor. The response was built for the modern media environment. Short, visual, repeatable, easy to clip, easy to share, easy to remember. In an age where attention is measured in seconds, that matters more than ever. And before long, the story wasn't about the accusation anymore. The story had become the response. Washington had delivered the opening blow. But Ottawa had just seized control of the narrative. And once that happened, the pressure didn't disappear. It changed direction. Because now, the questions weren't being asked in Ottawa. They were being asked in Washington. For a brief moment, the accusation had dominated the conversation. The headlines were focused on Trump. The political pressure was focused on Ottawa, and the questions were being directed at Carney. But after the mirror response spread across television and social media, something changed. The direction of the spotlight. Because now, journalists wanted answers to a different set of questions. Not, did Carney lie, but, does the administration dispute the data? That distinction was critical, because those are 2 very different arguments. One is political, the other is factual. And factual disputes tend to be much harder to manage once reporters begin digging into the details. According to the narrative that quickly developed afterward, White House officials soon found themselves facing repeated questions about the figures at the center of the controversy. Where did the numbers come from? Were the statistics accurate? Did the administration disagree with the agencies that produced them? And if not, why had the accusation been made in the first place? Suddenly, the political attack that had placed Ottawa on defense was creating pressure inside Washington instead. That's what made the controversy so unusual. The original accusation was supposed to focus attention outward. Instead, attention began turning inward. Political strategists immediately recognized the danger. Because once a public argument becomes a credibility battle, every response creates new risks. Reject the data, and critics may question confidence in government institutions. Accept the data, and critics may question the original accusation. Neither path is easy. Especially when cameras are rolling and the story is already dominating headlines. That's one reason communication experts became so interested in the exchange. Not because of trade policy, not because of economic forecasts, but because of narrative control. Who controls the story? Who controls the public conversation? Who decides what question everyone is asking? Those battles often determine the outcome long before the political argument itself is settled. And at this moment, Ottawa appeared to be winning that battle, not through volume, not through outrage, but through simplicity. The accusation required lengthy explanations. The response required only a few seconds. And in the modern media environment, that difference matters a lot. Meanwhile, news organizations continued amplifying the controversy. Panels debated it. Columnists analyzed it. Political commentators replayed it repeatedly. And with every replay, the same contrast became more visible. One side had delivered a forceful accusation. The other had delivered a calm rebuttal. That visual contrast became part of the story itself. Even people who knew very little about the trade dispute could immediately understand the optics. A heated accusation, a measured response, a complicated argument reduced to a simple image. That's exactly the kind of content that thrives in today's media landscape. Because audiences don't always remember the details. They remember moments. They remember contrasts. They remember scenes. And that's why this confrontation kept growing. The story was no longer being driven by economists, or trade negotiators, or policy experts. It was being driven by public perception. And public perception moves faster than almost anything else in politics. Yet beneath all the headlines, a much bigger conversation was beginning to emerge. A conversation about leadership, communication, and why some messages resonate while others disappear. Because as analysts continued examining the confrontation, many started reaching the same conclusion. This wasn't just a trade dispute anymore. It had become a case study in modern political communication. And that's why the story continued spreading long after the original accusation had been made. Because people weren't only debating who was right, they were debating who looked more believable. By this point, the confrontation had already escaped the world of politics. And that's usually when a story becomes truly powerful. Because political stories are watched by political audiences, but viral stories are watched by everyone. And this had become a viral story. Millions of people discussing the same moment. Not because they cared about trade data, not because they followed every development between Washington and Ottawa, but because they understood the emotional conflict instantly. One side made an accusation. The other side, that's a story people understand without needing any background at all. In many ways, this confrontation followed a pattern that appears throughout history. Pressure, response, conflict, reversal. The details change, the players change, but the emotional structure remains the same. And when a story taps into that structure, audiences pay attention. That's exactly why the mirror response spread so aggressively. Not because it was complicated, but because it wasn't. The message was simple enough for anyone to understand. And simple messages travel farther than complicated ones, especially in a media environment built around clips, headlines, and short attention spans. Communication experts later pointed to another important factor. The response never attempted to overwhelm the audience. It never demanded that viewers memorize statistics. It never required a deep understanding of trade policy. Instead, it invited people to ask a question, a simple question. If the numbers came from official sources, then where should the criticism be directed? That question became the engine of the story, because once audiences start asking questions for themselves, they become more engaged, more curious, more invested. And the more invested people become, the longer the story survives. That's why the confrontation continued dominating discussions days after it happened. The argument had evolved. It wasn't simply about whether someone was right or wrong. It had become a debate about credibility, trust, leadership, and communication. Those themes resonate far beyond politics. Business leaders recognized it. Media analysts recognized it. Public relations experts recognized it. Even people with no interest in trade policy recognized it. Because at its core, the story was about something universal. How do you respond when you're publicly challenged? Do you respond with more force, more emotion, more volume, or do you respond with control? That question sat at the center of the entire controversy, and that's one reason the clip continued spreading. People weren't merely watching a disagreement. They were watching two different styles of leadership collide in real time. One built around confrontation, the other built around restraint. One built around pressure, the other built around composure. And viewers around the world were deciding for themselves which approach appeared more convincing. That's when the story stopped being about a trade dispute and became a story about perception. Because in modern politics, perception can be every bit as important as policy. And whether people agreed with Carney or agreed with Trump, one thing had become impossible to deny. The conversation was no longer about the accusation. It was about who had won the credibility battle. In the end, the trade dispute will continue. Negotiations will continue. Governments will continue defending their interests. And new political battles will eventually replace this one. That's how the news cycle works. But every so often, a single moment rises above the daily headlines, a moment that captures something larger than the issue being discussed. This was one of those moments. What began as a dispute over economic figures evolved into a global conversation about communication, credibility, and leadership. A White House accusation, an Ottawa response, and a debate that quickly spread far beyond the borders of either country. Whether history ultimately views this as a turning point or simply a memorable political confrontation remains uncertain. But the lesson may already be clear. In an era of constant noise, volume alone doesn't guarantee persuasion, and sometimes the most powerful response in the room isn't the longest speech, it's the shortest statement delivered with confidence. That's why this story resonated. That's why the clip spread. And that's why people are still talking about it today. Because long after the accusation is forgotten, many people will remember the response. Thank you for watching USA News Now. I'm Daniel Mercer. And if you enjoy deep dives into the political stories shaping headlines around the world, be sure to subscribe, because the next chapter may already be unfolding. Until next time, we'll be watching.